that delay, but renewable energy in Africa is calling, and I had to have a meeting, and that was what it was about. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have a great panel ready for you, and it's about revitalizing the energy mix in Africa to get more renewable energy on the grid across the board. As you know, Africa has some of the best resources in the world. I think we see resources even in areas like in Mpumalanga that are better than in Germany. And Namibia has some of the best resource of solar. We have 59,000 gigawatts of wind energy potential that can power the continent 250 times over. But we still only have 1% of the total installed global renewable energy capacity. And this is quite unfortunate because it means Africans are missing out on jobs, on affordable, sustainable energy, and on the opportunity to really decarbonize the environment because we're the hardest hit by climate change. So we're here today to talk about how we can really unlock these opportunities. And I'm happy to have the panel with me. I'll ask also our tech team to give them microphones because I don't see them holding any. And while they do that, maybe I can also ask the two panelists online. Retabile, please, you can come on the video and you can please introduce yourself. As they say, ladies first. And then we can go from there.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure for me to be here this afternoon. My video is already on, so I'm not sure if you'll be able to see it on your side.
Yes, we're able to see it.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. My name is Nathalie Milamu. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the South African Photovoltaic Industry Association. We represent the interests of more than 500 companies that operate along the solar PV value chain in South Africa. And these range from OEMs, companies that are in the manufacturing space, independent power producers, engineering, procurement, and construction companies, small installers, which is perhaps more relevant for the majority or the bulk of the African continent, sub-Saharan to be specific, and financing institutions. And interestingly, in the South African context, the biggest utility is actually a member of SAPIA, ESCOM. So I'll stop here for now, and I will take on other questions at a later stage. Thanks for inviting SAPIA.
Thank you so much, Retabile. I think I'll start with Daniel because you're the closest to me at the moment. I'll hand over the mic to you. You can introduce yourself, the work that you do, that AFDB does, and then we can go from there.
Right. Well, it's a pleasure being in the Solar and Wind Pavilion. I've been to quite a number of pavilions over the last couple of days, but I've only walked past here, so it's a pleasure being part of the session. So my name is Daniel Schroth. I'm in charge of the Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Department at the African Development Bank. Just to highlight that we have placed energy at the very top of our agenda, recognizing that energy is obviously, as we all know, a critical input for economic development at large, and it's therefore quite logic and consistent, so that we placed this as our first and top priority. Maybe, I don't know if you want to do a round of, finish the round of introductions, or if I should sort of, yeah, okay, let me stop there.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Omar Negi. I'm head of wind at Infinity. Infinity is a joint venture between Infinity Energy, which is an Egyptian renewable energy developer, and Masdar, Abu Dhabi Future Energy Company. And it's a vehicle to develop renewable energy across Africa. I've been with the company for 3 years, and I've been in the wind industry for the last 10 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wangari, and thank you also to UWEC for inviting us. My name is John Lezamith. I'm Global Head of Public Affairs at wind turbine manufacturer Siemens Gamesa. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And one of the questions really that we want to talk about a lot, we have the CEO of the Solar Council in South Africa. We have big wind developers, renewable energy financier here. These are really the people who need to come around the table to make large-scale wind and solar power really be deployed on the continent. But we're still not seeing this happening. And I wanted to ask you guys, why do you think this is so? And what arguments really can you make to governments and to the people who we need to speak to ensure that we get renewables really out there?
Right. Well, it's obviously no single answer to that. Otherwise, I think we would have figured it out by now. I think, as you rightly highlighted, if we just look at the last 20 years in terms of global renewable energy investments, only 2% of those investments went to Africa. And that's despite, as you highlighted, the tremendous renewable energy potential across solar, wind, geothermal, hydro, and one could continue. So clearly there is an issue. I think one aspect is obviously the question of risk. And when we talk about risk, I think there are two dimensions. There's sort of actual risk and there's perceived risk. And when it comes to Africa, I think there's a very high degree of perceived risk. And let me just sort of give you one example. If you in fact look at, for example, Moody Analytics, in terms of defaults in the infrastructure sector more globally, surprisingly, Africa is actually the lowest rate of any continent in terms of infrastructure defaults. Yet there's obviously very little investments going into Africa. So I think one dimension is we need to address this perceived risk dimension, really kind of highlighting the opportunities, removing some of the wrong perceptions about investing in Africa. But that's not to say that there are not challenges as well. I think if we look at the African continent, renewable energy investments, they're concentrated in a couple of countries, countries that have made a lot of progress, obviously in the policy, legal, regulatory environment, that have also made a lot of effort in terms of structuring standardized procurement processes for renewables, whereas others still sort of lag behind on that front. So clearly the other element is financing, and this is obviously where an institution such as the African Development Bank comes into play. So we obviously do finance private sector projects. I think one of the key roles for the bank is sort of to help de-risk some of these investments, for example, by providing partial risk guarantees to help backstop the payment obligations of public utilities. That sort of is quite critical in a number of countries. When we look at the utilities across Africa, many of them are in a very difficult financial situation, and obviously this is an aspect that needs to be addressed, but it's not a short-term fix. So working with utilities, addressing all the governance losses and etc. issues will take time. So that's one aspect. Just one last one to highlight, which I think is really key from my perspective as well, is around investment in sort of the transmission infrastructure. And particularly for countries where there's hardly any grid and very limited capacity, also lack of investment for many years, it is very difficult to, even if there is sort of interest, to integrate larger amounts of variable renewables, whether that's solar or wind. So investing in grids, improving grid flexibility, and also the critical interconnections across the continent, that's also a key priority.
Great, and I see from the screen behind you, Hosman, I did not mean to forget you. I hadn't seen your screen on, so maybe I'll ask you the same question and also ask you to introduce yourself as you give us your remarks.
Hi everyone, just my apologies because I had some technical problem with my camera and background. Firstly, I'd like to thank you as Global Wind and Solar Council for the invitation. I'd like to thank all the audience and distinguished panelists for being there. It's my honor. I'm Sam Hassan, Sales Manager in Northeast Africa for Jinko Solar. And would like to tackle the same question from the perspective of the stability of the African countries, because many African countries suffer from the security and political instability, which usually affects high investment like solar and wind, because both of them are high capex industry. So either for the developer or the financiers or even the governments itself, because many governments they don't guarantee how long they will secure their position at such countries. So we hope at least for now we can target many countries which are somehow stable and they have even the sea or logistics access as ports, which usually facilitates the business there. The financiers play the vital role here in Africa because usually most of the projects lack the finance, which is the main pillar for both of the wind and solar, whatsoever the model of the project is, either EPC or wheeling or IPP or whatsoever, would usually finance play the vital role. So we hope by the COP27, by attracting the attention of the whole world, investors and funding institutions from all over the world, they should focus on the African market because it's one of the most potential markets for renewable energy, and of course they can do a lot of business here with good profits. It takes somehow longer process than other countries for the risk assessments, for the macro effects that they may face in such countries. But finally, this work pays off, and we see now many countries are developing wind and solar projects. And since I'm involved in solar, I'm seeing many vital countries now like Chad, Sierra Leone, Britannia, Sudan, South Sudan, South Africa, Algeria. Many countries in Africa now are focusing on the solar business, and they are granting good finances from all over the world. So I guess the potential is here. I'm just grabbing the attention of the financiers, and the more developed accounts as IPPs will be one of the best solutions.
Great, thank you so much, Osman. And over to you, Tabile. I'm interested because we've already spoken about it. Daniel's already touched on it. Renewables are the cheapest. They're creating jobs. They're the quickest to deploy. Why are we still having to convince our governments against gas? Why is the conversation still happening on the continent?
I think it's very.
I'm sorry, I'm just losing the focus because of this interface. So just please direct the question to the panelists. I'm sorry.
Over to you, Tabile.
Thanks, Gary. I think the African countries are in a very precarious position in that there's a huge need for energy. The SDG that was promulgated, SDG 7 specifically, talks about energy for all by 2030. And in 2021, more than 600 million people in sub-Saharan Africa still do not have access to clean energy or energy at all. And so I think government is trying to governments in the continent are trying to balance the need to address energy access, the pressing need for economic development, and they are faced with competing interest groups. And I think that's where the confusion is. There are interest groups for sure, but I think as a community, as both wind and solar, we need to be very clear about positioning of our technologies in solving these very fundamental problems that our continent faces. There is no way that we can develop and address the needs that we have, social and economic needs, unless we deploy energy at a rapid scale, at huge scale, and at rapid pace. So I think it's a balancing act, but I don't think we need to be preoccupied with the dynamics within government. Most countries, unlike a couple of years ago, now do have policies in place that support the deployment of renewable energy technologies. And other panelists have also already identified some of the challenges that we are facing in deploying deploying renewable energy, from risk, from lack of infrastructure, to just financing. But I think one of the challenges that we'll be faced with as a continent will be the skills or the capacity that is required to deploy the sizes of renewable energy projects that we want. Given the high level of unemployment in the continent, I don't think as a continent we can afford to be importing skills. If we are going to deploy or work out renewable energy for the next 10 to 20 to 30 years, there will be a need for us to invest in skilling our own people. We are the most youthful continent in the world. In fact, I am aware that about 60% of the African population, sub-Saharan Africa, is 60% of it is less than 25 years of age, and we need to make sure that these people are properly skilled, and so that those that are able to participate in opportunities in the energy space, renewable energy space specifically, are empowered to do so. And it's not just the skills on the private side and rollout of projects, but capacity within institutions that enable the rollout of renewables. Be in government, I think is the case in South Africa, where there is huge interest, high demand, especially given the current regulatory reforms that are favorable for renewable energy. But here there are, capacity challenges within institutions that enable this, be it within utilities, the regulators, maybe even other government departments. So there's a need to really focus on what we need within our economies to enable the rollout over and above what others will make available, like the banks, the development banks in the continent are now open. But who is going to do it? And how do we address the climate change, the energy challenge, economic challenge, but also the youth unemployment challenge that we face? So we are faced with multiple problems. And I think our sector, the renewable energy industry, is well poised to concurrently address some of these challenges that we face.
Great, and thank you, Tabile. I think you've also touched on something that's quite interesting. Kenya is committing 100 gigawatts of energy by 2040. South Africa is 44 gigawatts. Egypt, yesterday I heard, is at 28 gigawatts. As investors, and I'll start with you, Omar, I would think this would give us confidence. We would be going out and putting up wind turbines everywhere we could on the continent. But why is that not happening? And how do we change this narrative? How do we change it from, yes, there's large commitments, but there's no projects on the ground, to, oh, there's projects everywhere, and we're happy to see that?
I think, first of all, you have to have a detailed, defined energy strategy. And based on this energy strategy, you have to have put clear renewable energy targets and put an execution plan. And this execution plan has to match with the plans, because if it does not match, there will be a gap between execution and strategy, and this mismatch will give distrust to the investors. So first, you have to have the strategy, a detailed policies, and with these detailed policy, execution plan, and follow the plan. So all these announcements, they need to go from the strategy to policies and to execution. And this execution has to be studied well in details.
Okay, great. And over to you, John. Maybe you can tell me more about what you think.
Well, we see that, thank you very much, Wangari. I think that currently there are 1,200 million people living in Africa, and there are only 8 gigas of wind power installed, for example, Windwise. A country like Spain, it has 47 million of people, and we have 28 gigas of wind power installed. And there is, let's say, the forecast is that population is going to double in Africa by 2040. Electricity demand is going to double or even triple by that. So it is clear that the most competitive way to power Africa is renewables. It is also true that what we are seeing in the continent is that there are front runners, and I think Egypt is one of them, Morocco is another one, South Africa. But on top of, additional to those 3 countries, there is very limited scale. There is a need, but there is no scale. So what we consider is that investors like OMA and Infinity, what you need is a stable framework and predictable volumes. And additional to that, you need a political commitment from the country to deliver the additional infrastructures that you need this power to be evacuated. So transmission lines, this is the political commitment that you need. And also from an off-taker point of view, if you have heavy industries willing to commit to consuming green energy, you have already the demand, the aggregated demand. So from our standpoint, as you said, we have renewables, we have the need, we are more competitive than ever. So it is not economics. It is economics because it is a profitable investment. Why it is not happening in Africa? For us, I think it is the lack of a scale. And this is the reason why not looking countries, they shouldn't be looking into their own domestic needs rather than we consider the regional power pools, they may making a relevance into the equation. Because if you combine the eastern, the needs of the eastern regional power pool, the southern, the western, the north, if you combine the needs and you aggregate demand and you localize wind projects or renewable projects where they may be more competitive, not only because there is more wind, rather or sun, because it is also more competitive to build transmission lines, you have the business case. So this is what I think Africa is lagging behind, this Pan-African approach that maybe currently, Wangari, during the current geopolitical momentum that we are living, it is true that the discussion about how much Africa can power not only Africa, but other regions in the world, for example, by producing green hydrogen in Egypt or in Namibia, or that can happen. We have the money, we have the need. We only need the political willingness. We from the private sector, we are engaging with political stakeholders to share with us, we share with them our expertise and our willingness to do business in Africa, indeed. And we have Daniel. I mean, money is not a problem. And whenever there is a problem, Daniel is there to solve it. So
Absolutely, absolutely, Daniel. I hope you're going to be here for us when we do need that money. Retabile, I want to come back to you and break the order a little bit. And some countries in Africa, the country I come from, Kenya, has 90% renewable energy on its grid. Depending on how the wind goes that day, it could be up to 94. So how do we have more success stories like this? I know Kenya is a slightly special case because of its but there is quite a lot that is, a lot that is a result of the wind power and the solar power in the country. So Retabile, I want to ask you, how can we really scale that to over the 50% mark? And who do we need to have around the table to have these conversations to make sure that this does actually get done?
Thanks, Marjorie. Kenya is indeed a special case. And in fact, my home country of Lesotho is another special case in that whilst the demand is very low because it's a small economy, I think 50% of the energy is generated from hydro. So I think some of the solutions have already been highlighted, political will, and stability and rules for procurement at a large scale. So if you look at countries like Botswana, which have immense resources, but Botswana has similar resources to that of South Africa and Namibia. I think what may be needed, and I'm using Botswana as an example here, is an aggregation that the previous speaker spoke about. So the demand of a country like Botswana with vast pieces of land, but with a population of 2 million, with potential to deploy huge, large-scale solar, mainly solar in Botswana. I think projects would make sense if there is aggregation. Whether it's the southern, it's the coal in the southern African region and in the East African region, the likes of Mozambique. I think what's encouraging now is that there is a bit of government stability and clear policy direction in countries that whose electrification, as an example, is extremely low, like Mozambique. So I think on the one hand, there is a need for clear policy direction and clear procurement, especially if government is leading procurement. And how that government interfaces with the private sector, the rules around triple Ps, public-private partnerships need to be clear, and I don't think they're as clear in other countries. And so, yes, it's really about the rules of engagement around the deployment, but also aggregation, as the previous speaker has said. So I think as a collective, the SADC region is an example could, enable a much larger deployment of renewables than if each country, especially those that have a limited demand, like Lesotho and Botswana would have. Yet other countries like Gambia and Zimbabwe have huge populations with energy needs. And I'm using examples of the South because I'm most familiar with the southern parts of the continent. But I must say I have been encouraged by the work that renewable energy associations are busy with in the continent, especially the southern part of the continent. And they're beginning to bring the resources together, influence policy. So maybe the conversation around regionalization needs to start in making sure that there is engagement and there is reorganization of the renewable energy sector. In fact, even the renewable carrier in Kenya is engaging with the entire East Africa, which even is the southeast of the continent.
Yes.
So maybe the conversation of aggregation could begin to start there.
Okay, and I want to come to the man with the money here with AFDB. As a regional bank, you see that there is, or development bank, you see that there is a lot of need. I'm sure you get projects happening across the continent where you see an opportunity, let's say, to export to a neighboring country. And John touched on this earlier, that we need scale. What is the bank doing to enable to really connect these buyers of energy and creators of energy? And how can we really achieve the scale from what Retabile and John have touched on?
Right. No, I think what Jon said is absolutely right. I mean, we need to look at the scale up of renewables in Africa also in a regional context. I know this might be very difficult to say in a context where energy security seems to prime everything, but I do believe firmly in the regional integration agenda in Africa. And there are a couple of good examples, just to mention a few. I mean, in the West African power pool context, for example, you have regional solar parks that are being developed by the West African power pool, sort of kind of making sure that this energy that is generated, for example, in Burkina Faso, in Niger, will then be able to be exported to neighboring countries. It's quite complementary, the power system. You have hydropower, for example, in Guinea. You have solar then in neighboring countries in the Sahel, and that's very complementary. So that's the key focus from our side as well. We're financing a lot of the interconnections. Colleague mentioned mega solar in Southern Africa. That clearly also requires that we strengthen the various interconnections in that region. For example, the Sisabona interconnector, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Namibia, Botswana. That's also therefore one of the priorities that we've identified in the context of the Global Green Grids Initiative, where this morning was a lot of emphasis around there's no transition without transmission. I think that that's certainly true. Just to highlight one other aspect, I mean, we're trying from our side really to build sort of larger scale programmatic approaches. And the Sahel is actually an excellent example of that. We have our flagship Desert to Power initiative that is trying to seize the solar potential across the 11 countries of the Sahel, from Senegal in the west all the way to Eritrea, Djibouti in the east. And it's really kind of but trying to look at sort of this in a holistic way. So scaling up utility scale solar generation is one aspect, but transmission distribution infrastructure another, strengthening the power utilities to become credible off-takers a third one, policy, legal, regulatory environment, capacity building another one, and then also a strong focus, I think, on decentralized energy access solutions. And it was highlighted earlier, we will not be able to achieve universal access without sort of scaling up, whether that's mini grids, deploying solar home systems at scale in areas that are very difficult to reach by the grid.
Thank you. And Hosman, I want to come to you because I know countries like Nigeria are investing, gigawatts and gigawatts of solar power into solar power in the new energy transition plan. And this is, we're talking to the magnitude of billions of dollars. And I'm going to bring in something that a lot of people don't like to talk about, but that's the local content question. Because as much as we are spending all this, billions of dollars on these projects, how are we really involving the local communities to ensure that they benefit from this development and this leapfrogging to renewable energy that Africa will do?
Actually, good question. So you want to address The local content part, which is already applied in several countries, in Nigeria and also South Africa and Nigeria. Actually, this is more related to the regulations and policies and the stability of the regulation itself, because for GINCO, for example, we already had facility in South Africa, we had facility in Portugal, we had some overseas facilities, but the success of this facility and the sustainability of being on ground, it's related to the stability of the local content privilege and feasibility of this facility on ground, which shall be always competitive. So for many countries still in Africa, they are discussing the local content, but till now there is no sustainable and there is no guarantee of the local content privilege for like 5 to 10 years, for example, in order to be appealing for having an on-ground workshop or factory or whatever the skill is. So I believe that the regulations and policies are playing the most vital role in this part in order to give the security and give the guarantee to the suppliers and the manufacturers in order to invest locally on ground, securing vacancies and opportunities to the local people and developing the country in terms of manufacturing and the industry level in the country itself. But it needs some kind of stability, sustainable regulation, and even for the DG market, for the distributed generation, we see many countries still they don't have specific regulation regarding the distributed generation or plants like the net metering scheme, the self-consumption scheme, or anything related to the connection to the grid, which of course is still a big obstacle of operating in such countries, because the only solution is complete off-grid solution, and either with generators or with batteries, it needs big investment, which is not feasible for most of the end users in such medium or low income level countries. So that's why we come again to the financing part. So simply the regulation and policies will attract the manufacturers to build their facilities. And this is what we are negotiating with some governments in the region, and hopefully we can build something there very soon.
Great, thank you so much. And I want to come to you, Omar, because you have experience on both sides of the fence, wind and solar. As Infinity, you've just bought Lekela Power, I know it's public knowledge now. And how do you see that progressing? Because the complementarity of solar and wind, I mean, this is why we have the wind and solar pavilion here, is actually really key. It's as much as you keep developing rooftop solar, we also need a lot of wind to farm that up. What's your thinking around that? And do you see that as really unlocking large-scale wind in Africa?
Yes, I mean, the population in Africa is growing. A lot of urbanization is happening, and there's an enormous demand for energy. And Africa is blessed with natural resources. Africa has very good wind resources. Africa has very good solar radiation. So it's clear that we have to go renewables. If we had this discussion a few years back, it would have been debatable, because back in the days, renewables was very expensive. It had a cost to go green. But today, the technology is mature, wind and solar. Today, it has become mainstream. It has become the most competitive energy source. If you compare the levelized cost of electricity from solar and wind, they're much lower than all other energy resources. So renewables have to play a vital role in the upcoming mix of energy.
Great, and maybe I'll ask John or Daniel or any of the other panelists maybe to take the same question, because wind and solar together, as much as a lot of countries are investing one way or the other, there's actually the complementarity piece that really enables almost baseload-like profiles in some countries. So how does that enable us really to transition away from traditional fossil fuels onto a more sustainable 100% grid?
I think, Wangari, that as Omar was saying, considering that how much Africa is endowed with vast solar radiation and wind power, storage makes the perfect sense. It is true that up until now Africa may have, hydropower is a very good storage because of pumping, a very good storage solution. But we don't know how climate change is going to be impacting in hydropower. So bringing this element on board, what we are calling governments is that under the current geopolitical momentum, as Tanya was saying, we not only see in Africa, but in many countries around the world, a clear return to fossil fuels. I think that Ben Bagwell this morning said 2022 is going to be a record year, coal-wise, all over the world because of energy security. Although we had in COP26 a clear agreement to phase out coal, we are consuming more coal than ever. It doesn't make any sense. We may understand that there may be some extraordinary measures to be adopted currently to ensure that our economies, our people, and our industries are powered for this winter. That is fantastic, but that shouldn't jeopardize the long-term vision. So this is the reason why, again, we have already the technologies, wind turbines, solar panels, we have the solutions for storage. A scale is going to bring competitiveness of storage, and we have the perfect match. What we have to is aggregate demand, localize where it is most competitive to build. We have the private money, we have the development bank money, so we only need the political commitment. And again, we are not starting from scratch. Our company, Siemens Gamesa, we have built 127 gigas in the 5 continents. We will bring the expertise and willing to talk to politicians what our investors want to make the business case fly.
Exactly, and I know we only have a few more minutes because Daniel has to rush off, but I wanted to reach out to the audience and see if we have any questions. There might be something burning before I ask anything. So does anybody have any questions for the audience members? Yep, there's one in the back. I'll just walk over.
Merci. Je vais parler en français parce que je ne comprends pas beaucoup l'anglais. Vraiment, je veux remercier les panélistes qui ont bien développé les thèmes. D'abord, je me présente, c'est Ibrahim du Niger. Je suis du Niger, je représente une association de pasteurs, donc à la COP. Le sujet m'intéresse beaucoup parce que vous savez que le Niger, c'est un pays désertique. C'est un pays à soleil. Son énergie, c'est le soleil. Surtout, par exemple, dans la région là où je suis, à Agadez, 666 799 km², l'écart du pays. Cette région est essentiellement pastorale et aussi désertique, en grande partie désertique. Donc là, le problème de soleil ne se pose pas. Mais malheureusement, il n'y a aucune initiative, aucune politique qui permet aujourd'hui, par exemple, aux pasteurs de se doter d'un faisceau ou dans leur case ou dans leur jardin. Donc vraiment, ici, là, ça touche droit aux préoccupations des éleveurs. Pourquoi? Par exemple, moi, je suis dans une association qui est en collaboration avec un mouvement de femmes pastorales. Et c'est quoi l'objectif de ce mouvement? C'est l'autonomisation socio-économique des femmes et leur intégration dans les décisions politiques, dans les politiques du pays. Mais il faut voir ces femmes-là, si par exemple aujourd'hui on crée des petites entreprises d'électrification solaire, ces femmes auront des préoccupations qu'elles vont vraiment multiplier dans l'espace pastoral et que je pense que ça peut bien marcher. Donc par rapport à cela, aujourd'hui, par exemple, les éleveurs, comment ils peuvent accéder à ces financements, à ces possibilités pour développer? Dans mon pays, il y a une politique d'électrification rurale. Mais le rural, pour le moment, c'est au niveau sédentaire, sur la zone agricole, parce que mon pays est divisé en deux. Il y a une zone agricole et une zone pastorale. Mais la zone pastorale est la plus vaste par rapport à la zone agricole. Donc, maintenant, la question que je me pose, tous ces investissements, j'ai entendu beaucoup de possibilités, mais nous, on ignorait ça. Comment accéder à cela? Comment les éleveurs vont accéder à l'électricité peut-être même d'ici 2030. Donc, merci.
Sorry, I'm just going to confirm that I understood what I think I did. Ça, c'est le question que tu as posée. Okay. So he was talking about how there are large pastoral communities in. Sorry, I'll take a second so they can. Yeah. So he was talking about there are large pastoral communities in Niger, and they have real issues with power access. So he wanted to know, while yes, it's certainly true that there are the possibilities for people to access power using solar, it's very good talking about the possibilities, but how can you get governments to make real commitments to increasing solar access in such rural areas? I think that's about it.
Great. So does any of the panelists want to take that?
Yes. I think, like I mentioned before, there has to be an energy strategy. And according to this strategy, there has to be a policy. And according to this energy policy, it's not only about power generation, it's about power generation and network. So you have to have a grid infrastructure that covers all areas. And investing in the grid takes time. So governments have to look 10, 15 years ahead and invest in the grid and the network. And then once we have the generation, those towns or cities will be powered up.
Great. Thank you. I think we're almost, to the end of our session. Does anybody have any other questions? Okay. Great. So I think we will get one last statement from everybody on, how we can really revitalize the energy mix. How can we get scale? How can we get turbines and solar panels on the ground in Africa? And then we'll close there. So I'll start from this side now. So John, please go ahead.
For me, again, the Pan-African vision is fully needed. I mean, we have the African Union, we have the African Development Bank, we have the private sector as an industry, we have the private sector from investment. One of the game changers, and we have Omar as an example, would be we have the money, we have the need, we need Africans to invest in renewables. We need domestic capital being invested in renewables, because that could be the best signal that this is profitable, this is competitive, and how they are committed to unleash the full potential of renewables in the continent.
Great. Thank you so much. Over to you, Omar.
I think we need detailed energy policies, and with these policies have to have clear renewable energy targets and execution plans. And the execution has to match with the policies, because if there is a mismatch between execution and policies, there will be a gap between ambition and reality. So both of them have to go.
Great, thank you, Omar. Over to you, Tabile. Your last comment before we close.
Thanks, Barry. In addition, I think we need to think hard about decentralized system. One of the speakers alluded to it. The need on the ground is huge, and this cannot be achieved. The need cannot be achieved by just pursuing centralized systems. And for that to, even for a centralized system to be a reality, we need to think about how storage is incorporated into the mix of these complementary technologies, solar and wind. So I think we need to think about storage a lot more for a more robust and resilient grid. I spoke about skills. Skills are important for us to be able to achieve the goals that we have. And perhaps lastly, we need to avoid that push back into the continent through the fossil fuels. Most of the resources were rooted out of the continent, or the people that benefited were not really the continent as such. And we are still reeling from that, and I put this in inverted commas, resource looting. We hope that the renewable energy industry will be more conscious about Africa's development, and of course that requires that governments themselves have a collective agenda. So I like that notion of an African agenda, and some of these things are there in Agenda 2063, but it's one thing to have all these strategies there, and for those strategies to inspire Africans, it's another thing to have processes that makes that implementation a reality. Thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Great, thank you so much. And of course, last but not least, Hosman, please go ahead and give us your last closing comments.
I believe for the utility scale projects, maybe the interconnection will be part of the solution, even by small pools of countries, and then we can expand or create this network for Africa. And this would be a long-term plan, even for the continents to be interconnected with each other. And of course, now we have some interconnections between some specific countries, but it could be part of the plan for the utility scale projects. For the distributed generation will be decentralized. I believe raising the awareness level for the end users, which are working on through a big distribution network and campaigns in the African markets, and also negotiating with the governments for upgrading or updating the regulations related to the interconnection with or connecting the projects with the small residential or commercial or agricultural projects to the grid, where they can benefit from the few available hours of the electricity from the grid, beside the installed capacity from most probably solar, because wind is not something within distributed generation for small plants. So maybe for solar, this awareness level and these negotiations with the governments, which are already happening for some neighbor countries, I guess this will be the starting point towards more green African market, and then the interconnection would be more stable with good level of renewable energy generation from each country in the region. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you to all my distinguished panelists for being here today. It's been a fantastic conversation. I wish we could keep continuing to talk about this, because I still also want to touch about CNI and what's happening in that space, and I think that's quite amazing, but I think we'll leave that for another COP. And thank you so much all for being here, and please can we have a round of applause for the panelists. Thank you. Thank you so much, Adabile and Osman.
Thank you,
So thank you, everybody.